I've told some other younger moms who ask, when you get out of the physically needy years, don't be fooled. I think the kids have bigger needs in high school, but they're not as obvious. I would say for me as a mom, create large chunks of time where I'm just available and I don't know what's going to come across the kitchen counter with who's going to have an issue. And some days there may not be any big thing and some days they're huge things. But if I'm not there to be available, then my kids will find somebody who is available. What is important to them has to matter to me if I'm going to be relevant to them. So I think we're just trying to provide a place to raise adults. We're not raising kids, we're raising adults.
Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And today we are continuing in our Extraordinary at Ordinary series, which, if this is your first time listening to an episode in that series, this is basically where we have interviews and conversations with people who we think should be famous because we know that they are extraordinary, but they do so in very ordinary places and at ordinary things. And so, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about Tracy Kimzey, who we're talking to today.
Well, it is such a pleasure to introduce Tracy to you and to have this conversation, because if there's a kind of a profession, an occupation that qualifies the best for being extraordinary and ordinary, it's got to be moms. People who really dedicate their entire lives and often self-sacrificially give their lives in order to help their children. And in so many ways, it's considered mundane. Sometimes in our culture, it's even looked down upon in some ways. And yet, for my money, it's the one job and profession you can do that you absolutely know will change the world. And so the moms that I know, including my wife and my own mother, and then some of the hero moms we get to work with in Unbound, they are often behind the scenes. They're unnoticed. They're almost always underappreciated, and they're certainly not famous. And yet the work that they're doing is by definition always extraordinary, and it's always world-changing. And Tracy's one of those moms who is doing that for sure. But and from my perspective, she's extraordinarily skilled at it, because we've had the benefit of knowing her children, and her and her husband's children, and also having several of them, two to date and one coming up in the Ascend program. And so we've gotten to sort of witness what it looks like to have grown up in Tracy and Trevor's home and to benefit from that. And so it's really fun to hear from Tracy. She has what I think are some really helpful and heartfelt insights into parenting, especially adult children. So if you're in that category, this episode will particularly hit home for you. And if you're not, pay attention, because you will be sometime.
Most definitely. All right. With no further introduction, please enjoy this conversation with Tracy Kimzey.
Tracy Kimzey, welcome to the Be Unbound podcast. It's a delight to have you on here. I have known you for a long time, and I know you primarily initially through your children, and they were a significant and fantastic endorsement for you, and now consider you and Trevor to be friends of mine, in addition to me being able to be friends with your children. But you are the mom of 8, and for us, we're pleased because you're the mom of 2 and about to be 3 Ascend students, which is why we get to know you a little bit. And we're really pleased to welcome you to the podcast. So welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So, Tracy, you not only are mom of 8 students, but you have homeschooled 8 students. And I know that your oldest is an alum of Unbound. She was a former cabinet member for us, a leader. She continues to help us in many different aspects of the program now, working as a contractor on various projects. And Rachel is just absolutely an excellent person. And then you've had children that have done traditional college and have done really, really fantastic with that. And a couple doing those things. And then Abby is now one of our ATLs, one of our Ascend team leaders. And so we're looking forward to having new Kimseys in the program this year. But the point of all that is that when it comes to parenting, and even on the homeschool side, you're kind of a veteran. So before we ask you about that, tell me a little bit about what got you to the point of where you are now, both as a mom and as a parent, and even maybe as a homeschool mom. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, as far as homeschooling, we had no desire to homeschool. We made fun of all the people at our church that homeschooled and thought they were weird and their kids were weird. And God kind of convicted our hearts to understand why people were homeschooling. So we checked out some books from our church library we called them homeschool theory books. Like, why would anybody ever do this? And we still laugh at, we're not really sure what our prayer request to God was. I think we were trying to be nicer to people's faces, but still thinking they were very, very weird people. And God really changed our hearts towards homeschooling. And Rachel, our oldest, was probably 3 or 4 at that time, and we just really fell in love with it. So from that time on, it has just sort of grown naturally. I know a lot of people homeschool until they get to their kids' older years, and we felt like those were the years we had waited for. We wanted to, not get them to high school and then move on, but to be able to have the conversations that don't happen when they're younger. And so I'm still homeschooling. My youngest one is 8. My oldest is 26. So we've got third grade this year all the way up. We're still going. 4 of them are out of high school. And then when it came to college, we actually thought we've spent a lot of time investing in their education in a very different way. And so we wanted to do things differently when it came to college as well, or continue to think differently about it. So that's sort of how we got to where we are, and are still in the process as well.
You said something interesting there, that you were looking forward to the time when your children got older and the conversations you could have then. And so tell me a little bit about that, because I think that that is often the exact opposite of what people say. Now, I happen to agree with you. I've thoroughly enjoyed every stage. And like you, we're still in almost every stage. But the older stage has been just, I think, particularly delightful. But you said something interesting, that you were looking forward to that. So tell me why. Why were you looking forward to that age before it actually arrived?
I think some of it came out of some of our formative years. Both my husband and I came to know Christ in high school through Young Life, and that was a great time to really have some big conversations with our Young Life leaders. And I think that one of the main impetuses for wanting to wait for these great conversations was that my husband one time said something about a lot of ministry people, campus ministers or Young Life leaders, things like that. They work really hard to chase kids down with the assumption that they will have an influence in that person's life for Christ. But what we were seeing is that when a lot of parents do this, got to that point of high school of kind of like, I don't know, you can't do anything with them. They're just going to go their own way. They've got to figure it out themselves. And it was sort of like, wait a second. If I'm a Young Life leader and I can chase down other people's kids for Christ and have hard conversations or meaningful conversations, worldview conversations, and influence them, why not my own kids? And so kids were kind of young at this time, but we sort of shifted our philosophy towards Young Life has a term called contact work, where you spend time going to kids' games and practices and rehearsals and plays and whatever. You go where they are, and you continue to build relationships such that you share your lives so that you can share the gospel with them. And that was sort of the mindset we adopted with our kids. And so as they've gotten to older years, the high school years, that's when you can really do that. And they can really do that back with you. It's not just I'm coming to see your game, but you're telling me about your game, or you're telling me about your play, or possibly even participating in things together. So I think, like every parent that doesn't have older kids, you read it and think, oh, the high school years, they're going to be horrible. There's just going to be rebellion. We should just expect that. And we read a few homeschool authors that said that's not the only way it has to go, and that's not even necessarily the natural way it has to go. But so then we sort of adopted, let's make an effort towards shifting courses on that and having it be a relational time instead of just a growing apart time.
I was one of the weird homeschool folks, and so I was homeschooled, and I also, grew up, and I certainly got to a point where I had some different opinions and thoughts to my parents on certain things. You reach a point where you realize that your parents did a lot of things right, and then also that there were things that they had problems with, just like all of us who are mere mortals suffer with. But I didn't have a period of, when I thought my parents were really stupid, or that I had this kind of period of rebellion. I always had this really good relationship with my parents. David, I'm curious, for you, did you have that same experience? Did you have a different experience with your parents? Because you're also one of those weird homeschool people. So,
Yeah, I would generally agree with your assessment there, that I definitely had several realizations where I thought, I don't actually agree with my parents, which was just kind of this weird mental shift of going, wait, these people who I have been relying on for a source of truth and authority, like I'm starting to realize, wait, I like can and should have potentially different opinions. And so I think in some ways that's created just, I think, a lot more depth in my relationship with my parents, at very least, because we've been able to have a good enough relationship to have conversations out of that where I'm going, hey, I don't think that we quite see eye to eye on this. Like, have you considered this? And there's, a lot of the times we don't end up on the same page at the end of the day, but that's fine. So I've really appreciated that as I've grown older.
well, I've had the same experience with now I have 3 who are out of high school. And, it's an interesting time where they're making some realizations that, hey, there's some things that are different here. And as a parent, it's some of it's tough, because sometimes they make observations and I'm like, well, yeah, I'm probably wrong. So you get some of that kind of revealed. The reason I'm bringing that up, Tracy, is that what you said sounds somewhat normal to my ears, but I think very abnormal in our current culture. And so if you're listening to this, it may be kind of a somewhat radical thought that you would have a good relationship with your teenagers, and that a time of this teenage rebellion is not expected. So, Tracy, I think there's a point where we sort of, those of us who grown up in it think that's the way it is. Maybe if you haven't grown up with that kind of expectation, you think it's opposite. Just wondering if you are able to break down what was the difference? What made it different for you when you entered into this period? And you said, I want to have a relationship with my children and I'm not going to have this expectation of rebellion. What did that actually look like? Now that you're sitting in the situation where you've got some coming through that period, you have some on the other side of that period, and you have your some sort of, on their way to that period.
Well, I think the number one word I'd say is intentionality. I've told some other younger moms who ask, when you get out of the physically needy years, don't be fooled. I think the kids have bigger needs in high school, but they're not as obvious. And and that's a time where a lot of parents feel like I don't need to babysit you. You don't need me to even drive you places sometimes. And so the tendency is then I would find my own stuff to do because you have your own stuff to do. And instead we've tried to build intentionality to create. I would say for me as a mom, create large chunks of time where I'm just available and I don't there used to be a Peanuts cartoon where Lucy would sit there and said the doctor is in, right? That's kind of how I view it. Like I don't know what's going to come across the kitchen counter on any day with who's going to have an issue. And some days there may not be any big thing and some days there are huge things. But if I'm not there to be available, then my kids will find somebody who is available. And they certainly can. I don't have to be the only person, but I want to communicate I still see you and that you are seen and you are safe in this house and home is a safe place to explore decisions that may not be the same as mom and dad, just to kind of explore the consequences of your ideas. Consequences don't always have to be negative things. They can just be the result of what you're doing. But so we have tried to be very intentional that way, just to be available and be around in terms of seeing my kids. I think I keep learning. Everybody just want like adults too. We want to be seen to people. And so how do I see them? What is important to them? Do I pay attention? Do I know? I try hard not to ask them yes and no questions because especially some of my boys will answer with a no, yes, those kind of answers where I'm trying to ask to draw them out a little bit more. I'm trying to, if they're reading certain books, I'm trying to sometimes read alongside them. We try to make efforts to go where they go. And it's, not to the point of I have to be with my kids all the time, but it certainly is what is important to them has to matter to me if I'm going to be relevant to them. The same way I think of friends of mine are, they know what matters to me and vice versa, and that's how we build friendship. So I think we're just trying to really provide a place to raise adults. From the time our kids were young, we used to really think about that. We're not raising kids, we're raising adults. What kind of adults do we want our kids to be? And therefore, what do we say yes and no to along these parenting years to get to those places? And so we're still in the process of that. And each one of our kids is different. Each one of their needs in terms of how to be intentional with them seems to be different. Some of them it's staying up till 11:30 at night and watching a movie. Some of them it's, meeting for breakfast. Some of them it's taking a walk because the conversation works better side by side. But each one of them kind of has their bents and their giftings and their habits, and we sort of work hard to see what those are and come alongside them in those specific ways.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, both advice and experience talking. I'm going to maybe put you on the spot here a little bit to think through some of that transition. So, and I've got a little bit of advantage having witnessed your parenting and your parenting results, and so I'm working with a little bit of native understanding here. But there's as parents, we have responsibility for younger children to teach them to obey and to listen and do all those kinds of things. And so there's a guidance and a set of rules and a set of control that's necessary to protect and to train, right? And then I think one of the most difficult things of parenting is there's a transition period where you're half in and half out. And so I call, that early part, I kind of jokingly refer to as the benevolent dictator phase, where
Mhm.
I'm to do things when I tell you to. And then you move into this coaching phase. And I think of it more as an athletic coach where it's like, you have to play the game. I can't play the game, but I can still make you run laps and possibly do push-ups. So I have some control and I can restrict your ability to play the game. And so I have some control there as well. But then that final handoff is in many ways the toughest, which is that's the handoff where I'm the mentor and the decision to seek my advice is no longer mine, it's yours. In other words, the child has to come back. And so I was curious, as you were talking about entering this phase where you're available and when you're, kind of discerning how to spend time with your children, there's a point where you can do that. And I will just tell the audience that my observation is that you and your husband Trevor do this really, really well. And so I've seen you just be real experts at this. But I think that the other side of that is this kind of cultural helicopter parent idea where somebody is constantly involved and constantly holding on and really almost aggressively in a student's life. I'm curious if you're able to reflect and think about how you've run the difference between that, because I see you very much as somebody who's available for your children, but gives off no impression of being this kind of uber involved to the point of smothering type of thing. Do you have any idea how you kind of navigate that, or how you discerned how to stay on one side of that line or the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, well, one, I would say two things. Two things come to mind. One is that back several years ago, I read a book by Sheldon Vonnegut. It's called A Severe Mercy. And he was a man that knew C.S. Lewis, and he talks about a relationship with his wife. And he and his wife had this such a tight relationship that they created what they termed the shining barrier. Like, we shall not have children. No one should interfere with their relationship. This will be beautiful. And I remember reading that and thinking, I think that can be the tendency in parenting early on. Like, we will create this shining barrier and nothing will get through it. And we will, like, the TV, the movies, all the choices, we're going to make all the right ones. And I don't know, it doesn't take long to walk with your kids to realize the problem isn't just out there, it's in our hearts, right? And so full defense and full offense are necessary, and the barrier needs to be perforated. So I think what we then shifted to in terms of parenting was, how do we create dialogues with our kids? So we watch a movie together and we talk through a worldview, to the point where I can't watch all the movies my kids watch, but they have a set of questions that they kind of have in their heads to process these things. And I watch them now do that with some of my younger kids, where where I can be out of it and they do that. So some of it was just with them and talking with them from the inside out, because I can't be all the places and I don't actually need to, and I shouldn't be all the places they are. And as it's a graduated process moving uphill and we want you to succeed, to kind of get up and fly, it's not just we drop you off a cliff and you figure out how to fly. We're trying to want you to be successful that way. And so we're trying to put things in place. So yes, externals, we talk about movies, we talk about music, but you live in the world. We've got to talk about, how do you do that when nobody's there watching you? Who are you when no one is looking? The other thing I think I would say in terms of having relationships with the adult kids is, and some of my older kids are really great at this. They see us as, I don't remember seeing my parents as just people until I was probably much older. And maybe it's just because we are doing things differently. Some of our kids are at home in older ages. And then, I left at 18 when I went to college. And so I didn't see my parents a lot, but my parents both worked, so I did not see them a lot anyway. So I feel like we're visible to our kids in different ways, and maybe that makes a difference. I used to think that when I had kids, I would figure out all my sins would be done by the time my kids had like memory, right? So by the time they were like 6, I'd be over all the great sins and I would just get it right as a parent. And I just remember finding that to not be true. And so what the shift was, you know what, instead of getting it right, apologize a lot. Let them see who you are, talk with them through your own struggles, because if they understand, my parents are people who deal with the same kinds of emotions or the same kinds of struggles, triggers, things that set them off. My parents are trying the same way to make sense of their worlds that I am. Then that provides a different venue to kind of enter into and talk into as young adult kids trying to figure out the same things, And I'm not gonna lie, there are times my kids go places and I'm a mom, I'm like, I want to go right with them to whatever trip they're going on or whatever country they're visiting. That's scary. And so it's trusting God with that. I don't, when you're a young adult, you don't think twice about some horrible thing is going to happen to you. But mom lays awake at night like some horrible thing is going to happen to you. And so it is a growth process for me as well. It is a trusting process with the Lord and I, to keep trusting in him that he is where they are, even as he is where I am, and he cares for them and he cares for me. And so, you know, I think the natural sinful tendency in me would be to just hover and be right beside them all the time. But there's 8 of them. I mean, maybe that's God's mercy. I can't be where all of them are. And I'm thrilled when I'm not where they are and they come back and tell me how it went. And I think that's beautiful. Look at the growth that happened, you know, that happened because I wasn't there.
Yeah, one of the hard things is when your kids get old enough, they do really cool things, and it's not just that you want to be there to protect them. Like, that looks like a really cool thing. Yeah,
I would have
I'd
cool
like
things
to.
too.
I'd like to do that. I wish I had time to do that. And
Right,
at the
right,
same time, there's an element of, yeah, it's a really cool thing that they need to be able to do on their own, and so
right.
that's interesting. I think in a previous podcast, Dave and I were discussing the fact. I said, if there's one superpower that I could recommend for parents, it's the superpower of an apology. I've gotten lots and lots
Totally.
of practice at apologies, and I think if you're good at apologizing and you're willing to do so, there's a whole multitude of problems that can be covered over by that. Well, thinking about that, and I appreciate that. That's maybe a tough question, and so I appreciate your kind of self introspection to sort of think through that and answer that. As you've had your children, I'm thinking particularly ones who have transitioned into being adults. What were some of the hardest things about that? What were some of the points that you thought were the most difficult now that you had the experience of looking back over 4 times in that process?
I think some of it's just not learning how to relate and connect to them in different ways because when they're in your house, you connect with them just because they're there. There's a physical presence, and you tend to know who they're talking to or what they're eating or what they're wearing or the choices they're making just because they're of the proximity. They are not there, or when their worlds get or their orbit of life gets way bigger than the people I know, and they're talking about two people all day long that I don't know anymore. I think that has been hard just to find a way to relevant to. I think the other thing that probably most adult parents of adult children feel like you used to need me in your life, and that's why I was in your life. I want you to want me to be. I want you to choose me as a choice, as a mentor, as a even a counselor, and eventually, hopefully, as a friend. Right? I want you to that we can do this thing called life together, not because I need to buy your clothes or your food anymore, but because we have a deep relationship. And so, I think to me, for a parent, that's more to me that it's like jumping off a cliff. Like here we go. Like I'm setting this one free, and I'm not sure where they're going to land on this, and I respect their right to they have the ability to not choose me, and I know that, and I think life can be long. There may be seasons where they choose more than others and things like that, but that is something that causes me to really depend on the Lord to just sort of allow them to make their choices, allow them to move in the circles. Sometimes allow them to like not call me if they're at capstone and one of them checks in and the other one doesn't say hi the entire time she's gone. Like there's different personality styles, and I'm at home thinking like, why isn't no one checking in? Because I've done this long enough to know though that there are different personality styles. It's not necessarily a comment on me, but it is hard. It's hard to figure out how to kind of let go and how can I connect with you meaningfully in different ways instead of all this just familiar nearness ways that we used to.
That's yeah, there's a surprising vulnerability in that period where you have that realization that you were the center of everything, and then not only are you not any longer, but it doesn't make sense for you to be. Like, you
Right.
want the point is you want them to become adults. And that means that they shift their focus to outside things and to other things, and they start to grow into their own identities and their own families. And that is both the goal and also, in my experience, a hard transition to watch that happen, and then to have that vulnerability of knowing they have to choose to come back, and yeah, praying for God's grace in that period. Well, I think people spend a lot of time talking about the hard parts of parenting, and there certainly are some, and we've all experienced those. But let's flip that and say, talk to us a little bit about what has been some of the most. You started this by saying you and Trevor had an expectation that these would be good years, and that you were looking forward to those years, and that's part of the reason that you continued homeschooling and all those kinds of things. So now, in the midst of those years with some of your children, and going through that with 4 on the other end of graduating from high school and moving on to their adult worlds, tell us about some of the best things. What has been some of the most rewarding parts of that now that you've been able to experience those things as well?
I would I would say probably hands down the most rewarding part is how much I have grown as a person because of my kids. That they have parented me and they have drawn out of me and changed me and broken me and just the things they think of, the worlds they orbit in that they can bring back that I don't. It's almost like I've got like 8 lives instead of just my own. That, like tell me about your interests and tell me how, I have one of my kids is very interested in politics. And so we talk through the election and he kind of steers the family towards here's some of the issues. Here's what we need to think about. Here's what we need to, which is great because I can't do that. I see Rachel, my oldest, at her job and I watch her practicing hospitality and finding ways to have people be seen and known in the work community that she's in. And I think that's so exciting because I think I tend to live a fairly limited life. Like I'm at home, but in some ways I'm in 8 or 9 different places at once between my husband and my kids, and then they bring home these different parts of life that form them. So I think some of my kids getting to really see their giftings through whether it's a student cabinet or as an ATL or my 2 kids that did traditional college, they were both RAs on campus. They both did some study abroad things. All those things have just shown so much in my kids. So, I'm always in awe at what God has put in them. And then I get to be this watcher at what is coming out and how he is forming them. And so I think that has probably been the neatest, just seeing what is in them and getting to to be a bystander and a participant in that at the same time.
Yeah, I sometimes tell people that one of the unexpected rewards of parenting adult children was watching my children become better than me at certain things. And that has been in two categories. I have a son who's very musically, actually, I have multiple of my children that are musically gifted. I have a son who's particularly passionate about it, and I'm not at all. And so at a very young age, he was way better than I was at that. And it was a kind of thing that I didn't fully understand. And to your point, Tracy, it was like I got to understand it in ways. In fact, I had this really sweet memory of walking with him and asking questions that I've always been a little embarrassed to ask anybody about music, but I always sort of wondered. And for some reason, it was easy to ask my son. I was like, "Hey, I don't really, when you say that you're singing off key, what are we talking about here?" Just like that I never really wanted to bring up with anybody else. And it was kind of fun to ask Braden and say, "Hey, Braden, can you explain a few of these things to me?" And I think he got a kind of a unique thrill being able to explain some of it. And then there's the other side of watching some of my children become better at things that I'm actually reasonably good at. And that's ranged from things I remember when, I've been a runner most of my life. And I remember when my son looked over at me and I was running as hard as I could and he grinned and left, meaning that he just walked away. And I just like, well, we have just hit a point. I'm now in my declining years physically and he's in his acceleration years, literally. And so there's these things that they start to become better at. And you look at that. And I have found that to be almost more thrilling than the ones that do things that I don't understand, because it's like I do understand that, and it's so much fun to watch them be able to explore aspects of those things that I couldn't do or exceed better or succeed more at them than I was able to. So there's that interesting kind of piece where you do. I think that's the way you said it was really interesting. You've gotten to live 8 different lives, and yeah, you do have a front row seat at these unique creations that God has allowed us to be a part of and to see where they go. So. Well, as we wrap up, Tracy, you just have a wealth of experience on so many levels as a parent. My wife and I, Karen and I, have benefited from you and Trevor. You're a couple steps ahead of us in some of your children. And so we've watched and learned and taken notes and asked and occasionally requested prayers along the way. And so we've benefited from your advice and mentoring in so many ways. If there's a few pieces of advice or a piece of advice that you might leave for folks who are specifically parenting those children who are transitioning into adulthood, anything that you want to kind of wrap up with in that line?
A couple things that I feel like I'm still learning. One would just be that we want our home to be a safe place for our kids to figure out their stories. It's kind of everybody's living in a story, and some of that is what story are you telling yourself you're living in? And as I think sometimes we think we can outrun our shaping years as we become adults. And I've learned that like there's something about hitting 40-ish that like it's like a giant leash that like pulls you back in, that you're actually dealing with things that maybe you didn't realize were very shaping to you. And so we're just trying to provide almost a safe, secure place for our kids to kind of explore their stories, who they are, what they think about. The other two things that I feel like I'm watching different parents whose kids may be doing things that they don't agree with, and some of them, very severe things, is play the long game, you know, and I'm saying it to myself as much that as long as our kids are alive on earth and so are we, things can change. And I want to remember that. And then the other thing that is a challenge for me to remember, but I would say is the term that I had heard another place is to right size your relationship with your kids. And that's to me, that's hard because I have kids for whom I still need to be fairly big in their lives. And I sometimes feel like I'm one of those gymnasts doing a split on a balance beam. Like, you got the kids that you're trying to right size and become much smaller because that's where you need to be, but you're still need to be very present in some of the other kids' lives. And to do both, sometimes I forget, like, oh, that's right. You're 22. You don't need me to be that to you, but your 8-year-old, oh, you do need me to still be that to you, but it just kind of allowed myself to learn to be the right size in the lives that I need to be so that the big ones can get up and running and really fully blossom, and the little ones continue to have a safe home and a whole bunch of not just parents, but older siblings to really blossom under as well.
Well, I think that's great advice to end with, and especially that right sizing. I sometimes joke with my wife. I said, "You smell that? That's burnt clutch. That's me, clutching and trying to shift and trying to remember that I'm went from benevolent dictator to mentor to coach all in the space of 5 minutes. And if I don't get it right, we're going to really mess this up in terms of being in the right place at the right time." So, well, Tracy, thank you so much for being willing to come onto the podcast to share from your experience and from what you've learned. And thanks for I get to tell people this occasionally, and so it's fun to tell you publicly. We at Unbound have benefited greatly and significantly from you and Trevor's blood, sweat, and tears. And the children all of your children really, but the children especially that's in Unbound have been just huge assets and huge, enormous blessings to the program. Of course, I've got an extra personal blessing that many of them, all of them have been really close friends with my children as well. And that is just a blessing that's beyond words. And so thank you for all that and for allowing us to benefit from your hard work. And thanks for coming on and sharing some of that with our audience today. We really, really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for giving me a place to put words to some of the thoughts that was rolling my head a lot. So thank you.
Great. Thanks. Well, David, that went better than I expected, and I had high expectations. Just in the sense when I say better than expected, because, like I said, I know Tracy, and I have such a high respect for her and Trevor and their parenting expertise and what they've done. But like so many times we do this, she said so much stuff that's like, oh, either that put into words something that I hadn't fully understood, but more often it's like, oh, that's a really good point. I should pay attention to that. There is something I can learn there and that I didn't fully understand. And all of a sudden when you said it, I was like, oh, yeah. That's right. How did I not see that before? Or, oh, yeah, I didn't think about that, but that's really good information and really good advice. So I just benefited greatly from it and enjoyed listening and hearing. And I was just so impressed with the intentionality Trevor and Tracy's parenting, that they thought about, anticipated the time of their lives with the kids, what they were looking forward to, and then heard Tracy return it time and time again into her intentionality of the kind of atmosphere she creates in her home, which is really interesting because we talked a little bit in the episode that you have this kind of return to, well, excuse me, when you're mentor, that the children have to return to you, right? So you enter this phase of mentoring where you can't go and give your advice. For it to be effective, it has to be sought out. I thought one of the things that Tracy said it was really interesting was how she was deliberately creating the opportunity for that to happen. And that if you got nothing else in the episode, that's a pretty important thing to really think through. And I was just kind of reflecting as she was talking, wonder how I'm doing that in my own life and how I could do that better. So I thought that was a powerful part for me. How about for you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this whole episode and this whole conversation with Tracy really made me appreciate my parents more. I know my dad listens to these. Hi, Dad. But I just really appreciated her perspective and putting into words for me what I have experienced in a lot of ways, in that just the transition of my parents going from purely authority figures to, I like the illustration that you used, to kind of like the athletic coach space, to now much more kind of in the mentor and friend space, where I very rarely have any sort of doubts that I can take something to them. Like, I can always go to them and talk to them about something and think through something with them. I don't with everything, but sometimes that's because have just decided that that's something that I need to work through myself, or other times it's because I, at that point, have other mentors and other people who I'm talking through with things with. But there's never anything that I think like they're, going to react poorly, or they're going to like judge me, or like not accept me, or like have any sort of reduction in their love for me when they do that. And so yeah, I just have a whole lot of respect for them and for other parents like Tracy. And I think I've seen you be able to do this, Jonathan, where you're able to create that environment for your kids. So
I think Tracy brought out such a call to be humble. She obviously she was deliberate, and they do things deliberately, and they do it to a high degree of excellence, and they're really good at it, and they've got good results. And yet I didn't hear really any aspect of Tracy say, do things this way, or we figured these things out. I heard a lot of her saying, I've had to lean on the Lord's, that, one of the best things was how my children have transformed me. And that willingness to be transformed, that willingness to seek help from God, and that willingness to admit being wrong, and to putting a bigger emphasis on being present and listening than on being right and being, proactive and sort of pushing this sort of information or this kind of guidance onto somebody. That's a hard switch. And it's a hard switch if you're a parent, because you had to do it exactly that way for a period of time, and then you have to stop doing it. But if I could point to one parenting trait that I see, and it's worth reflecting here, I'm not claiming to be a better parent than anybody else. The only thing I have an advantage for is that I get paid to watch the results of people's parenting, right? And so I get more reps in that sense. There's those of you listening to this are way better in so many aspects of things, and some of those things that you get paid for that you're like, well, you're better at that because you get to do it all the time. And David had this unique opportunity where we get to work with students and we get to see the results of how parenting worked out, and then do some reflecting on that and see what worked and what didn't. And because of that, I would say that the one thing I would point to is that students who are exceptional in the program, full of exceptional students, are students that almost always, when you press in, had parents who had this humility and this willingness to adapt and to apologize and to listen to them. Now, I don't mean that there's no room for giving advice, there's no room for putting out rules, there's no room for holding the line on something. But those that have this willingness, especially with adult children, to create those safe areas that you just referred to, Dave, almost always have students who somewhat counterintuitively hold the line, obey the rules, have a lot of respect, and are the kinds of children that parents are quite proud of. And so I think it's an interesting observation, and Tracy did a good job observing that. So, well, David, as we finish up here, we'll just finish with pointing out that indeed Tracy does have several students in our program. And so Rachel is an early alum from Unbound, a leader in our program when she was a student, continues to be a leader in our program in so many ways. Now somebody who we invite back to deliver content and to teach and to guide and to help. Absolutely instrumental in a lot of our programs. Rachel is just a phenomenal person when it comes to leadership. So she's been very influential in training and teaching current student leaders. And that includes her sister, Abby, who is one of our Ascend team leaders and a member and is a member of our Ascend program. And so Abby continues a Kimzey tradition in her own right and has been a fantastic leader and just an absolute spark for our program. And so Abby and Rachel have been a delight to have in it. And that program is the Ascend program. It's our program designed specifically for students post-high school. It's a certificate program, which means a lot of things, but it means you can choose which track you would like to pursue. So if you're somebody who is ultimately looking to earn a college degree, we can help you earn 90 credits in the Ascend program and transfer that into a partner institution. More and more, we have students who are interested, not in a degree, but are interested in being prepared for a career and for a life after Ascend. And in case, we have multiple tracks to do that, tracks that will prepare you for life if you're not sure what you want to do, and we can put you on a discernment path. Tracks that will help you do specific things like video production and art and writing and those kinds of things. And then all of which that are geared to getting you into a community of people who can support and help you, and that ultimately provides a network for hiring you on the other side. And if I had to pick one aspect of Ascend that continually just blows me away, it's the community aspect of that. So, David, from your standpoint, what do you think stands out the most that makes Ascend kind of different from other places and other things?
Yeah. I think just it's the fact that it's a combination of giving students the opportunity to form real and deep relationships with each other, and they get to do that in person. This coming Ascend year, we're going to have 4 events, so that means that students are going to be in person with each other at events together every 12 weeks. They get to do that, but then they also get to then go home to the places where they live and actually work a lot of the times and apply what they've been learning in their local communities and still keep in touch with that community. So I really love that we have both of those components of having the absolutely essential in-person community and the relationship building at our events, but then also we really stress this is something that we're wanting the students to be able to apply where they are at, wherever that is, if they're still living at home or if they're striking out on their own for the first time or if they're studying abroad, whatever the case may be. We want to be able to equip them with where God is calling them in that moment in time and equip them by helping to foster real deep community.
Well, we want to be clear. There is a place for traditional college, particularly among folks who are looking for a really deep and rich academic experience, and there's excellent colleges out there that do that. But one of the observations we've made over the years is that people have expectations for colleges that are not matched by reality. So most folks I talk to, they want a college to be kind of an adult producing machine. I'm going to send a young person there who's maybe still an adolescent to come back an adult. And when you break that down, you say, well, I want them to go and have meaningful relationships. I want them to meet people that will provide a network for them for the rest of their life and build relationships that they'll keep for the rest of their lives. I want them to learn the skills that will allow them to function independently as an adult. I want them to be prepared for a career and for a job so they can ultimately become independent. And we jokingly refer to that to, we want them to go away and go from sleeping on my couch to sleeping on the couch. And if those are the requirements, then I would maybe not so modestly, but with a lot of confidence tell you that Ascend is a program that actually does those things. That students who come to Ascend find a network of relationships that, all the evidence we have to this point will last the rest of their lives. That they will find a program that specifically teaches them the practical skills that they actually need for life. And we're talking about the skills you really need. theoretical or academic skills, but the actual get your hands dirty stuff that each of us has to do in terms of communication and leadership and influence and practical day-to-day skills. And that finally will provide a network and training that will prepare them specifically for jobs and careers that allow them to become independent and to do the kind of work that builds the kingdom of God and helps their communities and serves others and allows them to thrive. And as an example of that, just this afternoon, before we record this podcast, 2 of our alumni reached out to me with positions that they are looking to fill. That basically they said, if you've got any Unbound students, any Ascend students who are willing to fill these positions, they're hired. And that is not an uncommon occurrence. And those are the jobs that we turned around and sent directly to our student body and said, hey, who's interested in these kinds of positions? If you are, basically all you have to do is show up, and your alumni, friends, people that have been through the program before you, who know the kind of education you're getting and experiences you're getting in the network that you have, want to hire you starting tomorrow, like where they're ready to go. And that's the kind of network that Ascends provides. And let me just add one final thing, which is working with students like Rachel and like Abby and like all the rest of them is one of the most entertaining, interesting, fun, fantastic things I've got to do my entire life. And so if you're interested in that, we invite you, because now's the time to get enrolled for this fall's class. We would look forward to being able to see you at our 4 events this year. And with that, David, any other final thoughts or observations before we close this out?
I think, yeah, once again, if you have a young adult who is looking to make the transition into becoming a full-fledged adult and striking out into the real world, take some tips from Tracy. Her advice was excellent. And B, check out the Ascend program. The website is beunbound.us, and you can find links to that in the show notes down below.
And until next time, be unbound.